Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's program, Ozark Outdoors, Hunting, War, and Fishing Stories. My name is Mark Livengood, and I'm director of the Story Center at Mid-Continent Public Library. For the next year, the Story Center is partnering with the University of Missouri Extension's Community Arts Program to offer a series of unique programs that commemorate the Missouri Bicentennial. Called State of Stories, this series of free public programs features storytelling workshops, storytelling performances, book conversations, and humanities programs such as tonight's that explore the history and culture of the Show Me State. Funding is provided in part by the Ewing Marion Kaufman Foundation. Tonight, we're joined by Dr. Mark Morgan, Associate Professor in the School of Natural Resources at the University of Missouri-Columbia. Dr. Morgan teaches classes in outdoor recreation management and conducts research on the human dimensions of natural resources as they relate to visitor behavior, communications, and policy. A former Fulbright scholar, Dr. Morgan has taught in and conducted research in China, Korea, Thailand, and Vietnam. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you, Mark. I appreciate the invitation. It's a great thing to be here.
Glad you could make it to Columbia over to Woodneath Library for our conversation tonight. And we'll be talking about your book, recently published, Ozark Outdoors. And why don't you tell us a little bit about the background and how the project got started?
Okay, thanks, Mark. A few years ago, I published a similar book called Hook, Line, and Sinker. And what I did was to collect some fishing stories from people in Missouri, from anglers in Missouri. And it turned out to be so good. I enjoyed the process so much that I decided to replicate it. So the first time I only focused on Missouri and I only focused on fishing. The second go around, when I did the Ozark Outdoors, I wanted to choose a geographic area that was a little bit unknown to many people. So I chose the Ozarks, and then I chose hunting and fishing combined as a mechanism to promote tourism in the Ozarks. You know, when we hear about the Ozarks, we hear a lot about things like Branson and places like that. And of course, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just a matter of there's more to the Ozarks than Branson. And so what I want to do is explore the outdoor aspects of the Ozarks, especially as it relates to hunting and fishing, because it's got a really rich tradition and culture and history associated with that region, but not many people outside the region know a lot about it. And so therefore, it's kind of a hidden gem.
And how did you go about beginning that project then? How did you get started with the research once you developed your interest? Where did you head to next?
Well, the first thing was funding, of course. I got some money from the University of Missouri, so my thanks to Amy Lannon and the campus writing program because she gave me an initial seed grant in order to get this thing off the ground. And so that turned out to be really good because I hired a graduate student named Leif Nordstrom to help me through the project. And through that, we taught a class, and then we collected some stories from real live modern day hunters and fishers in the Ozarks. And so after that process of collecting some stories and then going through the editing of those, then I had so much fun doing it. Then I thought, well, we need to expand this and make it into a bigger deal. So the book actually is into several sections. I first wanted to do a little section on natural history of the Ozarks because, again, some people might not be very familiar with this location. So I want to tell them a little bit about the natural and cultural history of that location. And then secondly, I wanted to collect some stories, which I did. But then I also wanted to collect some historical narratives of some of the early explorers. And so I went back in the notes and gosh, man, there's some great things out there. So I collected 4 individuals and a lot of their diary entries and journals. So I'd like to read a little bit of that to you now. But before I do that, I'd like to share a little bit about my source of inspiration for this particular book. And actually, it turns out to be Vance Randolph. He's a very prolific writer in the Ozarks. Of course, he's no longer alive. He lived from, it was 1892 to 1980. Okay, but Vance was an extreme outdoors person, but an incredible writer. He collected a lot of this information himself. He collected not only narrative information, but he collected folk songs and ballads, and he was like a one-man show. It's just simply incredible. And I wish that Missouri would give him a little bit more credit for the efforts that he's done here in the state in terms of making, I don't know, so bigger deal out of him, actually. He was born in Pittsburgh, Kansas, okay, so right on the edge of the Ozarks, but in another state. But his trip to Missouri as an early boy, as a kid, maybe 8 or 10 years old or something like that, to Noel, Missouri, actually cemented his relationship with the Ozarks. And so after that, he decided he wanted to live here and then also study the people that were here. Now, Vance moved around quite a bit, but he did live in the Ozarks most of his life. And then he wrote about these individuals in many different ways. Hunting and fishing was just one of them. So here's the original text, the book that was used. So this is, oops, sorry about that, Ozark Outdoors, okay, and the hunting and fishing in the Ozarks by Vance Randolph. And so when I found this, I thought, oh, what a great book. And I read it, but I thought, well, maybe it needs just a little bit of updating. And so Vance was he was a very avid outdoorsman and an active participant in each of his stories. But I thought maybe we could do something a little bit different and have a variety of individuals tell hunting and fishing stories rather than just one. And then I wanted to tell a little bit about the natural history of the Ozarks, and then I wanted to certainly collect those diary entries and journal entries from the early explorers. And so I've got a few of those, and I'll read a few just excerpts from it to help you understand a little bit more about my inspiration. So first, let me start with Vance Randolph. I probably need to get on my glasses to see this. Okay, so this is what Vance said about creatures in the Ozarks. And so again, it's one of those sources of inspiration for me. I think you'll like it too. There are many legends of gigantic beasts and fabulous varmints in the Ozark country. It may be that credulous backwoodsmen believe some of them today, but I wouldn't know about that. At any rate, the stories are still in circulation. Hill folk tell them to their children, just as parents elsewhere used to entertain their offspring with yarns about dragons, centaurs, griffins, mermaids, and the like. Perhaps the children don't really believe all this, but it sometimes amuses them to pretend that they do, and thus the tales are preserved and transmitted from one generation to the next. So you see exactly, it's about storytelling, and it's about folklore, and it's about not only collecting and preserving this information, but most importantly, transmitting it from one generation to the next. And I'm not sure we're doing such a good job of that. As I look around and I see a lot of youth today, they seem to be on their cell phones, or on the computer or something. I'm not sure how much information is being transmitted about the outdoors, especially about hunting and fishing. If you talk to any of the resource management agencies, whether it's in Arkansas, Missouri, Oklahoma, all of this region, the biggest issues are recruitment, retention, and reactivation of hunters and fishers. And so this is an issue. It's a big issue, not just in this region, but it's a big issue nationwide, as a matter of fact. Because I'm not saying that all of our traditional outdoor sports are dying away, but they're not exactly increasing in number either. And so one of the issues is to try to have various strategies to kind of reinvigorate the population, or perhaps invite new members to participate that haven't done so already. So I thought, well, rather than, focus on something like hunting and license sales or permits, or, like Bass Pro does a great job of selling equipment and things of that nature, I thought I would choose something a little bit different to try to spark the imagination of individuals out there to get them to want to do outdoor type activities. And so my choice was, of course, folklore. So who else better to choose than Vance Randolph, the king of folklore? So it turned out to be a perfect match. So after we taught the class, we edited the stories, and then it just kind of kept on growing from there. So I added several different sections to the book. So that's a little bit of how it started.
And in that first section, you feature 4 early accounts from explorers or people who had come to Missouri, some of them looking for lead resources, and then ended up doing a lot of traveling around the area and then writing about it in their journals. And one of them was Schoolcraft, and there were several others. Can you talk a little bit about what those gentlemen encountered and observed when they were here?
to. Henry Schoolcraft is known as our Missouri naturalist, but it's kind of interesting because he was a tenderfoot in the woods. When he came down from New York, he didn't know anything about the outdoors. He was owned a glass factory in New York, and so after that was closed, then he decided to kind of strike out in a new life. And so he wound up on the Missouri frontier of all places in Potosi, Missouri, and he was looking for lead deposits. And so I would like to share a little bit of information about Henry with you. Here's his quote about the stories, and then I'll tell you a little bit more about him and his life. When seated around his cabin fire, the old hunter excites the wonder of his credulous children gathered into a group to listen to the recital of his youthful deeds, and thus creates in their breasts a desire to follow the same pursuits and to excel in those hunting exploits which command the universal applause of their companions and crown with fancied glory the life of the trans-Alleghanian hunter, whether red or white. So Schoolcraft, like I said, he began this 900-mile trek through the Ozarks in November of 1818. And he had a colleague named Levi Pettibone. They didn't know anything about the outdoors, and they didn't shy away from this fact. So here's one of the excerpts from his diary entries. We find it necessary to gain a knowledge of things of which we before knew nothing, and in which we had not any experience, such as the art of hobbling a horse properly, with safety to ourselves and without injury to him, the best method of building a campfire, how to cook a piece of venison or boil a pot of coffee. Even a local woman admonished Henry. She told us that our guns were not well adapted to our journey, that we should have rifles, and pointed out some other errors in our dress, equipments, and mode of traveling, while we stood in astonishment to hear a woman direct us in matters which before we thought the peculiar and exclusive province of men. So you can see a little bit about Henry Schoolcraft. We call him our Missouri naturalist, but I suppose it's tongue-in-cheek. The next individual is George Fanshawe. He lived from 1780 to 1866, and he came down and actually explored Missouri in the early portion of the 1800s, and recorded some things in his diary which would be astounding today. He saw Carolina parakeets, he saw ivory-billed woodpeckers, he saw passenger pigeons, all of which are extinct now. So this is George Fanshawe's comment about stories and a little bit about his life and what he did. His happy moments are all outdoors, where nature, always clean and always attractive, generally compensates him for every privation. There, clinging to the open woods and the murmuring streams, as long as daylight lasts, he reluctantly seeks the habitation of men only when compelled by want of food and rest. So you can see that after you read this, gosh, you should want to get excited about the outdoors. The next individual is Theodore Peace Russell. And again, he's an individual that came down with his family. He was 18 at the time. He came down from Connecticut because his father was tired of the kind of a political landscape in the New England in this time period. And so they wanted to make a break for it. So lo and behold, they wind up on the Missouri frontier and near Arcadia Valley. So Theodore Peace Russell became quite a writer in his own sense. And so he wrote in the Iron County Register. He wrote for many years. He wrote a regular column. So here's one of his excerpts that I found to be very interesting. And again, it relates to stories. And this is the theme of tonight. I found that there was no subject to talk about so interesting to both old and young as a good hunting or fishing story. They never seem to tire of hearing about the early life in the woods. I sometimes feel sorry for the young folks that are coming on the stage when all of these old times will have passed away and live in books and memory. Should old times be forgot and never be brought to mind? Like old sailors, we old hunters never tire going over our hunting exploits. And after all, I do not know of anything that's more exciting than to sit before one of those great fires and listen to a good story well told.
And when was that written?
I'm sorry, what?
When was that written?
That was, well, his time period was 1820 to 1899.
Mhm.
I'm not sure exactly when he wrote that piece. He came to Missouri in, I think, 1838 or something like that.
Mhm. Mhm.
And then the last individual that I'll read, it's just a kind of a source of inspiration, is Silas Claiborne Turnboat. And he actually was born in Missouri, but lived a good portion of his life in Arkansas. And that's one of the points I want to make in the book is the Ozarks crosses boundaries. So it's actually the southern part of Missouri, it's the northern part of Arkansas, and the very eastern part of Oklahoma. So it's this geographical area that's quite diverse. And it has been kind of overlooked over the course of time, I guess probably for several reasons. But what I wanted to do was to find this area and then publicize it a little bit more. So this is Silas Turnboat. Way back during the lifetime of the old pioneers, they loved to talk about meeting the bear and the stealthy panther, finding rich bee trees and killing deer. It was a pleasure for them to meet together at some public place and exchange yarns with each other. But the old pioneers are nearly all gone to their long homes. A new generation have sprung up. Times, customs, and conversations have changed.
So those gentlemen and their excerpts and observations really are the first section of your book. And the second section then focuses on those more contemporary stories that you were talking about that you intended to take Randolph's inspiration and then look at those stories in a contemporary way or how people are telling them now.
Right.
And are there parts of that second section that stand out?
Yes, I have a few stories to share with you in that second portion of the book. Like I said before, Randolph was an active participant in each of his stories. And to broaden the base of support, what I wanted to do was to share the wealth. And so I invited quite a number of individuals to share with me their hunting and fishing stories in the Ozarks. So it had to be hunting or fishing, and it had to be in the Ozarks. And so we got quite a number of those stories, and then we whittled them down to about, 32 or something like that, that we actually put in the book. And so I'd like to read a couple of those to you. Now, some of them they're all interesting and very humorous. It just turned out to be a real pleasure. So this one is called Don't Come Home Without the Dog by Mark Abney. Last August, my brother and I were jug fishing for catfish on a sunny afternoon at Truman Lake in the Missouri Ozarks. Beforehand, we caught about 20 green sunfish to use as bait. When everything was ready, we found a nice cove about a mile from Bucksaw along the south side of the lake. After the jugs were set, we went back to gather some more bait while keeping a close eye on our lines. Suddenly, the sky turned black, indicating the presence of stormy weather. I told my brother that we should get the jug lines in and head back to the truck. We'd collected about half of them when a torrential downpour hit. The wind began to blow violently, producing 4-foot swells over the lake. Each wave engulfed the bow, which caused standing water inside the boat. My trusty German shorthair named Ruger had completely hidden himself under the driver's side seat. I knew that we were not going to make it back to the truck, so I found an area where we could beach my boat to protect it from the wind and the rain. When we neared the bank, the engine prop struck the bottom and the wind started blowing us back out into the lake. I yelled to my brother to hit the trim and raise the motor as I jumped off the bow and pulled the boat to shore. As soon as I had the boat secured, I reached for my cell phone to check the weather. It was soaking wet. My brother and I made it to a shrubby area with a rock bluff to our back, providing some protection from the howling wind and pelting rain. After we got settled, my brother began to pray out loud for God to save us, as if we were going to die. When he finally took a breath, I asked him just one simple question: how are we going to die? Logical explanations were racing through my head: lightning strikes, falling trees, etc. When he said hypothermia, I was floored. I answered, "It's August. How can we die of hypothermia? It's 70 degrees." My brother said he was cold and began praying out loud to God once again. I interrupted and told him to look toward the middle of the lake. My brother said, "What's that?" It was my boat, dislodged from the bank and now adrift in the midst of the storm. Ruger was still on board. My wife warned me that if I did not have Ruger when I came back home, then I should just keep on going down the road. This turn of events terrified my brother even more. He transitioned from normal prayer to chanting in tongues, something that only the Holy Spirit could decipher. I could only understand the word die every so often. With each lightning crack on the water, his chanting would intensify. I interrupted him again, pointing to a boat with 3 men making their way to Buxall. Once my brother made eye contact with him, he raced to the bank, waving his arms like a madman, yelling, "Save us! Help us, please!" The men heard my brother, but it was raining so hard that they could not see us on the gravel bank. Slowly making their way to shore, they agreed to get my boat and the dog. My brother began to pray again, this time for rescuing us and for our safe passage across the lake. When we arrived at the drifting boat, I was relieved to see Ruger under the console. Thanks be to God for ensuring a happy wife after returning home.
And what was the storyteller's name?
Mark Adney.
Mark Eben. And how did
Don't come home without the dog.
and how did you connect with him in the course of your research with your students? And
Well, actually, I sent out a lot of different notices to different individuals. I put notices in like MU News. I put something in the Conservation Federation of Missouri, their email newsletter. So I sent out quite a request for stories widespread and got quite a number of those. So some of these people I actually know, other people I don't. I actually happen to know Mark. He's a good friend of mine.
and so they would send you the written stories. And
Yes.
yeah.
Yes. And then the class would actually do the edits on that. Now this turned out to be a little bit tricky because you don't want to steal the author, the voice of the author. You don't want to steal the thunder. But some of the people could write a little bit better than others, and so they just needed a little bit of shaping. And so what we did is just to shape it without trying to be possessive of the language. It's just to make it a little bit more readable in a book type context. So that's what we did. And like I said, it turned out to be a really fun project. The students had a great time with it and they enjoyed it quite a bit.
So were they involved in all aspects of the project then?
Pretty much. The students were involved in most of the aspects, especially with the stories of the editing. Now, I wrote a little bit on they edited some work on the early pioneers. Okay, so they did a little bit of work with that. And then they also wrote a little bit on the intro to the kind of the natural history section chapter. And but then later, after everybody finished, then I went and polished that up before publication. So.
Well, we want to hear another story for sure, but I want to ask people who are watching if they have questions to feel free to send a question or two to Mark in the comment section, and we're happy to shoot that his way. But please just type it in the comments, and we'll hear another story and hope that we get some comments coming in here.
Sure, it's great. Okay, so this one is entitled "From Behind My Tree" by Mike Whitaker. So, "From Behind My Tree," Mike Whitaker. Some of my best moments outdoors are just now a dim memory. However, I'm certain about this particular event. It was deer season in southern Missouri during the late 1980s or the early 90s. I was in the United States Army at the time, but had taken leave to catch up with some of my friends and get out in the woods. My flight arrived in Kansas City the night before, and by the time I traveled to the camp and got some sleep, the alarm sounded dreadfully early. Although I didn't feel rested and didn't have the best plan, I knew where my friends were and where I wanted to hunt. After a few yawns and a cup of coffee, I made my way through the darkness to a small wooded area that had a history of funneling deer. I didn't have a stand, so I rested my back against a large tree that was higher on the slope, one that would give me a good shot with my 30-30 just after sunrise. It was chilly as I waited. Finally, the sun peeked over the eastern skyline, illuminating the reds, oranges, yellows of the Ozark fall. Squirrels began their early morning chatter, busily tramping through the dry leaves. It tricked me into thinking a deer would soon arrive. As the sun rose higher, the warmth brought drowsiness. I'm usually not one who falls asleep while hunting. However, on this occasion, with travels not so far behind me, my eyes may have closed. To be honest, there was no may about it. They did shut. It was so quiet, a mouse sounded like an elephant. As I hovered on the edge of sleep, I felt confident that the crunch of leaves under hoof would serve as an alarm clock, thus waking me. The time came. I focused a small amount of attention on the sound to decide whether it was worth a full-fledged awakening. The crunching came from directly behind my tree, but it was still a distance away. I noted that it was a steady rhythm, different from the hopping sounds made by squirrels. My focus heightened, and I may have even opened my eyes. Nothing in front of me, but as I said, the sound was coming from behind. It stopped, so I thought it was a false alarm, and my eyes began to shut again. Before I could fully close them, the noise started again, only this time growing louder. Whatever it was, maybe a monster buck, was walking directly toward my tree. Adrenaline crashed through my drowsiness and my senses were on full alert. I was filled with shame as the noise drew closer. If I were more disciplined and awake, I could have turned to face my quarry while it was still some distance away. Instead, I was stuck with my back against a tree and my gun pointed in the wrong direction. Perhaps the buck of a lifetime was creeping up behind me. I could do nothing except stay still and wait it out. Maybe it would get close enough so that I could still get a good shot. It did get closer. The creature sounded like it was taking a fistful of leaves and clapping them together right next to my ear. Finally, after what seemed like an hour, I realized that it was directly behind me. I held my breath and heard it take a couple of steps around the tree. There was movement in the corner of my eye. A turkey crept around the base of the tree and stepped over my legs, catching a glimpse of blaze orange. I don't know who was more surprised, me or the turkey. The experience will be forever blazoned in my memory. I didn't know that birds could show facial expressions, but that one did. It locked eyes with me. Its beak flew open, emitting a silent scream. That turkey thought it was done for. I was close enough to reach out and throttle it. The turkey's legs started moving so fast that its neck simply couldn't keep up. Off it ran, but I don't think it ever took flight. I guess in the heat of the moment, it forgot how. That turkey was probably glad it was deer season. I don't remember if I got a deer that day or not. When you're out in the woods, you never know what's going to happen. you might create memories of something completely different than expected.
Was that a story that was written and sent to you then, along with
Yes.
the others?
Yeah. And this is the cool thing about it. I mean, each of these, well, it's, it's part, fact and part fiction. It's like asking an angler, to tell a true story. You don't know if it's really true or not. So we think they are true, but it certainly fits within the realm of folklore, no problem.
Yeah, and it's also something that it sounds like you could definitely imagine that whoever the author was, I forgot his name, but telling
Mike.
that story, Mike, telling that story to his friends and family in person,
Yeah.
face to face, rather than just writing it down.
Right. He couldn't have made that one up. Okay. No way.
Yeah. So, how do people get a hold of the book? Where can they buy the book if they're interested in purchasing a copy?
Well, I just published it not too long ago, and so I've been a little bit delinquent in some of the publicity efforts. Okay, so it is on Facebook Marketplace. It is on Missouri Life, their website, so you can purchase it there. There's maybe one, Ozark Land, okay, the Ozark Land stores, they have copies of it. So there's a few mechanisms to get the book if you really want the physical copy. Or of course you can always get in touch with me. I've got several copies at the house and I'll be glad to get rid of them. So you can just, I'm easy to find. I'm at School of Natural Resources, University of Missouri. So you could phone me, you could email me, and I'll be glad to make an arrangement to take your money.
Mm-hmm. And so you teach in the School of Natural Resources. So how does this work, collecting these stories and publishing these stories and listening to them and encouraging that they're passed along and that people are expressing these stories? How does that enhance your work in the school department, in the Natural Resources Department? How is it different than other aspects of what you might do and what your colleagues might do?
Well, actually, I work on quite a number of different projects, so this is just one of the many projects that I've been involved with. But my biggest project is Asian carp right now, so the folklore thing is just kind of a sideline. But I will say it's not a very crowded field for folklore and natural resource management. And so I take great pride in knowing that I'm one of the few out there that is collecting stories and then trying to put them in forms that can be easily reproduced and transmitted to other individuals. We did this with the Fishing Stories book. We've done this with the Ozark Outdoors stories. And so it's one of the things that make, faculty, a little bit unique. We're just given the task to work, and they don't tell us what to work on. They just say do some stuff and make it good. And so I have been doing this work with folklore for quite a while. But like I said, it's really just one of my projects. But I found it to be so enjoyable. I just had a great time with it. And then, if time permits, I'll read one other section that Leif and I put together about fabulous creatures in the Ozarks. There's some mysterious creatures that are wandering around out there, and you probably don't know it. But we collected quite a number of a number of stories about these creatures. So I think you're going to be very pleasantly surprised to hear about this collection.
Yeah, could you let us know about some of them?
Okay, so here we go. Now, there's no way for me to describe in the book, there's no way for me to tell you how many of these creatures that are running around out there in the woods. But I can tell you that there's a lot of them. Okay, so we have quite a number from, let's see, creatures such as the Camden County sea serpent, the chalgreen, the cluebird, the filly-loo, the fishhound, the galupus, the gollywampus, the gollywog, the goroo. You get the idea that there's a lot. And if we have time, I'll read a little bit about the cark or the carcagni, which happens to be one of my favorites. But we'll start by just talking about this intro between kind of natural history and folklore and some of the connections associated with it. Folklore is an important but overlooked way to blend nature, culture, and history. Many of the stories feature wildlife, often associated with hunting or fishing trips. Some accounts are true or contain elements of truth, but many of them are just fictitious. Fantasy lends itself more easily to storytelling than facts. Superstitions are abundant in the Ozarks, mainly due to the people who live there and the natural resources on which they depend. The region is sparsely populated, has a rugged landscape, and plenty of animals. Relative isolation increases the value of entertainment and humor. Many of these tales come from Appalachia, moving south and westward following the early settlers, mostly of Scotch-Irish descent. Storytelling is one thread of a social tapestry that connects people, places, and pursuits through the generations. We probably need a little bit more of that today. Wildlife stories often share a common theme. An ordinary animal becomes an enormous or fearsome creature. Such embellishments are likely given enough time and boredom. Hyperbole about elk, bears, or panthers makes perfect sense. These animals are powerful and dangerous, sometimes emitting terrifying sounds at night. Killing the beast before it harmed people or livestock was both logical and masculine. Men who performed such actions became larger than life, just like the animals in some stories. For example, a reputable source in Van Buren County, Arkansas, claimed that panthers, or painters, would stalk children and sometimes climb down a chimney after newborn babies, crazed by the smell of mother's milk. Despite the fact that panthers are infrequently seen, any experience with them, real or imagined, was memorable. Gene Graham once told about the Flora Jones, the first steamboat to travel up the Osage River to Harmony Mission, Missouri, in the spring of 1844. One of the early settlers plowing his field heard a long wailing cry, followed by an angry roar, and thought it must have been a panther. Grabbing his rifle, he rode into Papinsville, only to find out that others had also heard the terrible screams. Every able-bodied man quickly gathered their guns and their dogs. Although the hounds failed to pick up any scent, the varmint continued to approach. With rifles cocked, hunters made ready for the monster, which they could hear puffing and blowing and roaring as he floundered along, apparently following the river channel. When the steamboat finally came into view, the backwoodsmen were so astonished that it left them speechless. Perhaps some of the settlers had heard of steamboats back east, but none of them had actually seen one until then. As steamboats became more common on the Missouri rivers, so did the number of panther sightings. Turtles and bullfrogs are common in the Ozarks, but it's unclear why the ones which lived long ago were any bigger than those that are found today. Apparently they were. A turtle killed in the Buffalo River near St. Joe, Arkansas, made a meal for 40 families with 2 barrels of soup left over. A boatman on the White River once remarked that the frogs in the bottoms were as big or as large as full-grown steers. So big, in fact, they were butchered like hogs and salted in the winter. Vance Randolph later asked a storekeeper in Calico Rock, Arkansas, to verify his frog story. His response was, I reckon they were as heavy as steers, but not as tall. In 1949, a fisherman in Marys County, Missouri, reported killing a 21-pound bullfrog. However, the local game warden said the incident was 20 pounds of bull and 1 pound of frog. Okay, so here's the Carcagny. I think you'll enjoy this one. Supposedly dating from the French fur trading era and said to have been involved in the death of Paul Bunyan, the Carcagny, or the Carc, as it's known, is one of the Ozarks' most mysterious creatures. This denizen of the limestone country was said to feed mainly on section corners, accounting for their relative scarcity throughout the current river area. The Carc only walks backwards and uses its slender, vibrating forked tail to cut through the Ozark hills. It also uses its otter-like whiskers to cover its tracks. And, as Ed Wood explains, it's claimed by some that this is because he doesn't give a darn where he's going, but he just wants to see where he's been. A nocturnal animal, the cark is hatched from square eggs, so as not to roll down the sides of hills. It's born without hair, brains, or teeth. Witnesses say the cark is red in color, but sometimes blue, and at times is a combination of colors. Local legend has it that the carcagni can be seen only through the bottom of an old Forester bottle. The cark eats uranium and is attracted to radioactivity. Some say the cark flies over the forest like a plane spreading nuclear refuge to enhance the Ozark soils. The true origin of this creature is not entirely known, but tales say that radioactive fallout after the first atomic explosion at White Sands caused the mutation of western creature, the Rumptifsul, resulting in the creation of the carcagni. Others claim that the creature arose from logging camps in Oregon, Washington, and Montana and Idaho, where Canadian fur traders had informed the woodsmen that the cark was especially abundant in their region. The beast relocated to Missouri once the CCC was formed in the 1930s. Men from the Pacific Northwest were brought to Missouri to supervise the CCC operations. An old forester named Ed Woods supposedly originated the carcagni to impress and dumbfound timber tenderfeet. So there you go, the carcagni.
And that's one of many of these creatures.
Oh yes, and you'll have to buy the book to find out more these interesting stories. Sorry, I can only share one.
And what's next? Are you going to be working on this some more?
Well, this project is actually finished now, and so I have one more folklore project, but it's not in the United States. Okay, so actually, I wasn't really prepared to talk about this one, but I will say a little bit about it. Not this year, but last year, I was invited to go to Nepal for about 2 weeks. And so during that trip, the purpose for my going was to go to the couple of national parks and interview villagers in the buffer zones around the national parks. And so what I wanted to do, and I couldn't speak their language, of course, so I had to have professors go with me, and then they had some graduate students to help conduct the interviews. So this is a project we're working on now, but I haven't finished it yet. And I wanted to collect some information, folklore or stories about the tiger from the villagers, because the tiger it is a source of tremendous folklore. Oh my gosh, it's like the most amazing thing. So I was very pleased to get a wealth of information associated with this. And so we're still trying to dig through some of this now to kind of analyze it. But the tiger is it's like a godlike creature in the forest. It's very mysterious. It's a source of many superstitions. But the point of this was that, many wildlife tourists come to the national parks, and number one, to see the tiger. I mean, if they possibly can. So killing the tiger would not be a very good thing, because there's a lot of wildlife tourism a lot of money generated through wildlife tourism. And so that money is shared with the buffer zone communities. So the idea is like, even if the tiger comes out, it might kill your livestock, but you shouldn't retaliate against the tiger because, it's really a source of income for you, in the long run. So we wanted to get some stories from these individuals, and it was simply incredible. I had a great time. And I would highly recommend Nepal. So, if you get a chance to go, then I would definitely put that on the bucket list.
So that work in Nepal, and then also this kind of work, really suggests the importance of working with local communities to understand how they interact with these natural resources as a planning tool, as a policy making tool.
Yes, it is very connected because conservation depends on people. We don't often think in terms of conservation as just doing something like, producing deer or turkey or, saving endangered species or something like that. But really, there's always benefit for humans out of this. So, Missouri Department of Conservation doesn't produce deer or turkey just for the heck of it. It's for human benefit. And so we need people to help with that process of management. And so we call it co-management. So Missouri Department of Conservation relies a lot on private landowners, okay, to help them with this conservation effort. So MDC also has many other initiatives, such as stream teams and things of that nature, because they don't have enough personnel to do all the conservation work themselves. So a lot of it depends on people, and the long-term success of conservation always involves people because it needs political and financial support. So the old saying, maybe you've heard before, ducks don't vote. Okay? So there you go.
Mm-hmm. So the book is Ozark Outdoors, Hunting Lore and Fishing Stories by Dr. Mark Morgan. And we have time for another story, Mark, or another
I have
the book you want to share?
And then if there's any other comments or questions that you have, I'll be glad to answer those, or from the audience, as a matter of fact. So I have just one last thing in closing.
Okay.
This collection of stories about fish and wildlife is nothing more than a sample of folklore taken from individuals in a bygone era. Each of these tall tales and superstitions make connections with nature in ways that seem to be lacking in modern society. If technology devalues the simple pleasures of life, then folklore is more important today than ever before. Among other values and benefits, storytelling can provide a temporary escape for reducing stress and tension in our daily lives using humor. It can also influence active participation. The Ozarks are an ideal setting for interactions with nature, including consumptive and non-consumptive activities. On your next visit to the Ozarks, create an outdoor story and share it with others, either face-to-face, in writing, or using social media. Through you, the legacy continues.
Well, thanks for being here tonight with us, Mark.
Well, I thoroughly enjoyed it. I had a great time. I love reading the stories. I love talking about the fish and wildlife. I love the Ozarks. It's a wonderful place to visit, and hope that you go down there and do some outdoor activities, whether it's hunting or fishing or other things for that matter. There's so much beyond Branson. There's a world of outdoor opportunities. The rivers, the lakes, the streams, and the forest, the hills. It's quite an incredible location. And it's just perfect for outdoor entertainment and pursuits.
All right. Well, thanks again, and we hope to be outdoors again soon, especially given this lovely weather we're having. And I want to thank everybody else for joining us tonight. And again, the book is Ozark Outdoors, Hunting, Lore, and Fishing Stories by Dr. Mark Morgan. And thanks again, and have a good evening, everybody, and stay in touch with the Story Center.
Good. Thank you.
Good night.